I bet you thought when we started covering adaptations that we would go to the Stephen King well more than a few times, and believe me, we will. Today though, we're covering our second John Carpenter-helmed adaptation after we discussed The Thing in the inaugural episode. While that one was pretty well known for being a more than faithful adaptation of the book his hero Howard Hawks had adapted, not a lot of people may realize that They Live was sparked from a very short comic that adapted a very short story. We came here to chew bubblegum and find out what the f*** happened to this adaptation.
And I'm all out of bubblegum.
While John Carpenter started to make a name for himself in the 70s with his student film Dark Star, seminal slasher Halloween, and the Western-inspired Assault on Precinct 13, the 80s was his decade. During that time, he would get an Academy Award-nominated performance out of Jeff Bridges for Starman, have one of the best Stephen King adaptations with Christine, and pair with Kurt Russell for two of the decade's best genre films. And that's just directing. He would write, compose, and produce for a number of other projects, and his entire catalog for the 80s needs to be viewed and discussed. He would close out the decade with a movie that is close to rivaling Halloween in its cultural relevance. The movie released on November 4th, 1988, and made $13 million off its $3 million budget. It was pushed back a couple of weeks to coincide with the election, and that paid off as it opened number one at the box office before falling off shortly after that. Reviews were split at the time, but it has since become an all-time classic of both 80s sci-fi and message movies. Carpenter wrote and directed the film and co-scored it with his longtime buddy Alan Howarth. It was the last of 8 collaborations between the men, and the music feels exactly as it ought to with these two creating it. The cast is led by wrestler Roddy Piper, Keith David, and Meg Foster. Sprinkled in are Carpenter regulars George Buckflower and Peter Jason in minor but important roles. Kurt Russell was actually in mind for the main character Nada, but Carpenter thought better of it since he had worked with his good friend so many times previously. While online trivia lists a murderer's row of action talent, Carpenter was smitten with Roddy Piper after meeting him and watching him at WrestleMania 3. A lifelong wrestling fan, he knew that wrestlers could perform and thought Piper had a good everyman look to him, even with the large physique. Piper had been wrestling for some time and appeared as Quick Rick Roberts in the 1985 comedy Body Slam, but They Live was his big break and he even quit the WWF to make the movie. He would be the lead in Hell Comes to Frogtown as Sam Hell that same year, but They Live is his legacy. He would go back to wrestling and show up in tons of direct-to-video fare until his death in 2015. Keith David is the main co-star here, and the role was written directly for him by Carpenter. David has had a wonderful career in action, horror, drama, and has that amazing voice that has led to some of the best voiceover in cartoons and video games. He's still very active today and played the patriarch of the animal training family in 2022's Nope. Meg Foster has electric eyes and has been consistently working since the late 60s. Masters of the Universe, The Osterman Weekend, Leviathan, Stepfather 2, and most of the recent Rob Zombie movies all have her in some capacity. She was a mainstay on TV for the first few decades of her career, and she still finds time for episodes here and there. 8 O'Clock in the Morning is a very short story written by Ray Faraday Nelson and first published in 1963 for the November issue of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. You all thought that Children of the Corn was a tiny story to adapt. This one makes it look like it in comparison. It's a whopping 1,800 words. The script for the video you are watching about the story has more words than that. It will take you longer to watch the greatest fight in cinema history between Keith David and Roddy Piper than to read that story. Bill Ray would then turn the short story into a very brief comic called Nada in 1986. While they're nearly identical, it was the comic that inspired the big nerd of all trades Carpenter. Nelson was born in October of 1931 and got his start as a cartoonist for various science fiction publications. While he's most well known for today's short story, he did publish 10 books, including one with his longtime friend and very famous sci-fi writer Philip K. Dick. And what is considered his best work, Blake's Progress, was published in 1975. Oddly enough, he's probably most famous for inventing the propeller beanie hat. Look it up. With the story being so short, the movie's going to encompass most of what the written version has to offer. Both properties follow a nondescript man named Nada as he finds out that an alien race has infiltrated Earth, and he tries to figure out how to stop it, or at least spread the word. After finding that both, people don't want to believe him, and that he's surrounded by too many aliens to do anything about it by himself, Nada decides to go to the local TV station. He's figured out that they broadcast through TV and radio signals, and that's how they keep people under their trance. At the TV station, he's able to kill the TV crew and uses the still broadcasting television to wake up the rest of the world and start a war. Unfortunately, he doesn't live to see the work he did and dies as the rest of the world wakes up. Well, like I said, to fill a 90-minute movie from a 6-page short story, you're gonna take some changes and add a lot. First, let's look at the minor differences from story to comic. The story starts with Nada waking up from a hypnotist show, and boy did he ever wake up. He sees the audience as normal humans mixed with the aliens. The comic book has Nada walking the streets already, being able to see the signs and the aliens, with no revelation as to why he can suddenly see these things nobody else can. Most of the rest of the stories are in line with each other, except that when Nada kills an alien in his apartment, he steals an alien dart gun in the short story and a standard Uzi submachine gun in the comic. The final change is the very end where Nada dies. In both versions, a controller, or alien, calls him and tells him that he will die at 8 o'clock the next morning. In the story, his heart just stops, while the comic has more or less him dissolving after the heart attack begins. As for the movie, Carpenter had to fill a lot of time and did so by adding characters and giving the story added stakes. Frank, played by Keith David, is completely made up for the movie iteration, as is everything connected to his character. There is a device, the sunglasses, that enables our heroes to see the aliens and their signs, while the story it's only Nada and it's due to the hypnotist event. We don't see much of Nada's backstory in the comic or story, and all we know of his movie counterpart is that he is a jobless drifter who is out to LA from Denver after a decade of solid employment. The story, he has a girlfriend that Meg Foster becomes sort of the avatar for, although it takes some time for her to become a love interest, and she of course betrays him when the story counterpart just doesn't see what he sees. In both mediums, Nada kills with little problem. The story one does it first to refocus after he starts to lose his newfound sight, and then in quick succession in the apartment building to both try and convince his girlfriend, but also to get more information and supplies. There aren't any alien weaponry in the comic or movie, as they just use firearms, but there is a communicator in both. In the story, it's a communication device that he doesn't fully understand, but takes it with him along with the weapon. The movie turns this into a communicator and some sort of escape device that Frank and Nada use to get out of a tight spot and into the alien's secret hideout. This is a natural progression that takes a small element from the story and expands it for the movie. Finally, there's the subject of human collaborators. In the story material, the humans besides Nada are simply asleep or under control of the aliens. Carpenter takes the girlfriend character from the story and turns her into the reluctant love interest who almost ends the human race's hopes to escape. She's the one that gets almost all the resistance killed, and she even kills Frank in one of the saddest deaths of the 80s. We don't even get to say goodbye to him, man. They also run into the formerly homeless Buck Flower, who is now in a nice suit and set up for the rest of his life. While the motivations for Meg Foster's Holly are unknown, Flower's drifter is motivated by greed and finally living the good life. While both story and movie end very similarly, Nada is shot down as he blows up the alien's cloaking device, and he flips a defiant bird to the bad guys instead of having a mind-controlled heart attack. In a pretty big blowout, the movie is by far the bigger legacy of the two. With respect to a fine science fiction author and his very short work, he's better known for a hat contraption, while They Live as a beloved and highly regarded work in a director's very loaded catalog. While the story and comic are neat and brisk reads, they lack the characters, score, action scenes, one-liners, and the single greatest street fight in the history of cinema. Sleep 8 hours, work 8 hours, and obey. Watch They Live.